Order. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for joining us at this evidence session on e-cigarettes and alternative smoking products. Perhaps for the record, you could introduce yourself and tell us which organisation you are representing this morning.
Of course. My name is Dr. Moira Gilchrist. I'm Vice President of Scientific and Public Communications at Philip Morris International.
Morning, my name's Dr. Ian Jones. I'm the Vice President of Reduced Risk Product Science at Japan Tobacco International. Before that, I was an anatomical neuropharmacologist at the University of Bath.
Hi, I'm Chris Proctor. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at British American Tobacco.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Grant O'Connell, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Fontem Ventures, a subsidiary of Imperial Brands.
Well, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. We're obviously looking at both e-cigarettes and heat not burn. I'd just like to focus on e-cigarettes to start with, if I may. Can you each briefly tell us what research your organisation, your companies have undertaken on the health impacts of e-cigarettes and what your findings have been? And perhaps we can just go from left to right.
Sure. So we've been working quite hard on a range of different alternative smoke-free products within our portfolio. We have been looking initially in terms of e-cigarette science at some of the science around the toxicology of the carrier agents that are used in the most common electronic cigarette products. So we've been looking at the toxicology of propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin and nicotine to understand how that may affect the toxicology of e-cigarettes in general. So that's been our focus to start with. But we're moving through now for our new product, which is on the market currently here in the United Kingdom. We're going through a very full assessment programme to understand its health effects relative to combustible cigarettes. So looking at not just chemistry, but also toxicology, systems toxicology, and ultimately we will be doing clinical studies. We're not quite there yet, but that's what we're working on for electronic cigarettes.
Thank you.
Okay. And for us, very similar, we have a mixture of what we call the fundamental science, looking at, for example, the effect of different coil materials on the vapor chemistry and different propylene glycol glycerol ratios, through to assessments of products we have in the market, such as our Logic range of products, where we conduct chemical, toxicological, in vitro toxicological tests, through to, at the moment, we're conducting short-term clinical tests on those products in the USA.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Okay, we've done a lot on e-cigarettes. We were the first of the tobacco companies to enter into the e-cigarette market in 2015 with Vape. And since that time, we've been doing chemical studies, toxicological studies and clinical studies on Vape and our other e-cigarettes. And the research is very similar to that the Public Health England have reviewed, and that you find far fewer toxicants in the emissions from the e-cigarettes. The toxicological impact of those emissions is much lower than with cigarette smoking. And we're about to start a 1-year-long clinical study which will include an e-cigarette to look at biomarkers of both biological of exposure to toxicants, but also to biological effect markers to see what the longer-term risk might be.
Thank you.
So at Fontem Ventures, we manufacture and market the vaping brand Blue, and we take a systematic approach to our science around our products. So if we look at the aerosol chemistry of the Blue portfolio, we see it's got a very simple chemical composition compared to conventional cigarette smoke. That in turn results in minimal biological responses in traditional toxicology assays. But we're most encouraged by our clinical research with the Blue product, where we were able to demonstrate that just over 5 days, smokers switching to Blue had significant reductions in harmful chemicals in their blood and urine. And actually that was largely indistinguishable from smokers that quit cold turkey over 5 days. So we're now into the phase of our clinical research around the Blue portfolio.
Okay, thank you. What is the scale of the research that you're doing? I mean, you said you talked about clinical trials and testing a long 1-year trial. But is this what's the size of the cohort that you're working with?
Yeah, try.
Yes.
On the clinical study, it's a big one. It's over 1,000 people. In fact,
Right.
what we were having is several arms of the study. So the study will compare people who quit smoking for a year. So in that arm we have 800 people, with people that switch from smoking through to either our tobacco heated product Glow or to one of our electronic cigarettes. So, and in order to do a year's long study, you need a large starting population to ensure you get enough people at the end of the study to actually do the analysis for the biomarkers of exposure, the biomarkers of biological effect.
Okay. Would anyone else like to comment on the scale of their? Moira?
So I can talk to the work that we're doing on heated tobacco products, because that's the furthest advanced in terms of the assessment we're doing. But similar to what Dr. Proctor said, we're doing large-scale clinical studies looking at the effect of switching to our IQOS product, which is a heated tobacco product, over the course of a year. So again, we have around about 1,000 participants in that study. We're looking at the impact compared to stopping smoking altogether. And shortly we'll be releasing data from the first 6 months of that study, and the other clinical studies we've done are actually very encouraging. So we've done a 3-month study that looks at the same type of markers that we're looking at in the year-long study, and similar to what my colleague said, the results show that the reductions in biomarkers of exposure, so exposure to harmful chemicals, comes close to that seen in those who stop smoking altogether for the duration of the study. So very encouraging.
Okay. Thank you.
I was going to say, similar from our side, we're actually, for e-cigarettes, in the middle of a short-term clinical, so a week-long study, which that has hundreds rather than thousands because of the dropout rate is less over a shorter period of time.
Okay. Thank you.
So we just recently published one of the first long-term clinical studies over 2 years. Similar to what Dr. Jones said, we have some dropouts, but our study looked at 209 smokers switching to...
Did you say 290?
209. Switching to an e-vapor product, and the results showed after 2 years of use of this product in the real world, there was no safety concerns with this product, so it was very well tolerated by the smokers.
Thank you very much. And just final question on that before I move on. Some of the trials that are up to 1,000 people, is 1,000 a big enough sample group to make sure that you understand the impact it would have on differing types of people within that group?
Yeah,
Go on.
you go ahead, Moira.
Well, we looked at this, our statisticians looked at this for a long time in designing the study to understand what's the impact of people dropping out over time, but also ensuring that we can capture the impact of dual use, for example, because that's a concern. We need to understand whether there is a decrease in effect when people are dual using. The preference is that people switch completely to these products, but we do need to understand what the impact of dual using with combustible cigarettes would be. And then we're looking at different age groups, and we're also looking obviously at gender as well, and seeing if there are any differences there. And we will be able to do that with the sample size that we have.
I was just going to add that, very similar to this, we conduct what's called the power calculations prior to conducting such studies. Depending on the question you're asking, you want to detect a difference, and then there's a statistical method to determine the sufficient sample size you need to detect that difference.
Okay, my answer is going to be slightly differently, because I think when we look at what Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England have said on the relative risks of e-cigarettes, where they believe 95% or more are less risky than smoking, but there's a need for both product standards and long-term research. In that long-term research, the year-long studies may not be enough, because biomarkers of biological effect change quite slowly. So eventually there needs to be cohorts of people that follow for much longer periods of time than that. And that's why I think kind of ensuring that we're getting kind of feedback from safety reports of e-cigarette use is good comfort as we go along that journey. But eventually there's going to need to be longer-term epidemiological studies to determine exactly what the relative risks of e-cigarettes are compared to other products.
Thank you. You talked about the Public Health England report and the 95%. Firstly, what does 95% mean? Just quantify that for the the public outside? And secondly, is what are your own findings about the difference between conventional cigarettes and e-cigarettes and the safety differences?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's well knowledge now there's a risk continuum where cigarette smoking is by far the most risky tobacco and nicotine product, and nicotine replacement therapy is the least risky. So you've got that continuum there. The only other thing we can actually place with accuracy on that continuum is snus, the Swedish oral tobacco, because there's been long-term epidemiology, and that comes at about that. So if cigarettes are here, NRT's there, it's kind of there about the 90-95%, as the Royal College of Physicians have said. With e-cigarettes, we're really educated conjecture because we don't have that epidemiology. So you can't, with accuracy, pinpoint exactly where they should sit. But the fact that they have far less toxic emissions than cigarette smoke. So most of the things that are formed in cigarette smoke, which are known to be the harmful chemicals, are absent in e-cigarettes. But there are some chemicals that are still there, so you get some thermal breakdown from things like propylene glycol and glycerol, which may cause some risks. So we're Public Health England, and the data we've got pretty much is consistent with where they are coming down on, is they're saying, well, we think it should even be better than 95%, but there's still a residual risk of 4 to 5%. But those risks could be minimized if we introduce proper product standards, plus we also need to do that long-term epidemiological research to be sure that is actually happening across all people.
Okay, thank you.
If I may just add, Mr. Chairman, I think one of the things that we understand from our research is that it is really the burning of tobacco that's causing the main issues associated with smoking-related diseases. So the moment you have a product where you're not actually introducing burning of tobacco, then you're likely to have a very significant reduction in health risks. As Dr. Proctor said, quantifying that risk will take longer-term epidemiological studies. We've started those types of studies for our heated tobacco product, which is on the market in Japan, and we've seen a large amount of switching of smokers to those studies. So we're looking at what's the impact on disease risk reduction over the long term, and that will really begin to start to help us to quantify what the percentage of risk reduction compared to ongoing smoking is. But right now, as Chris said, then we're really making a conjecture about what that may be, but certainly all the science points in the right direction of a very significant reduction in risk.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I think, agreeing with what Dr. Proctor said, it's quite difficult just now to accurately quantify an exact percentage figure here. But I think what Public Health England tried to do with the 95% figure was actually communicate to smokers the magnitude of risk reduction and how less harmful electronic vaping products are, and it was a way of communicating to the smokers in an easy-to-understand language. But to that end, the message is not getting through, particularly in the UK, where an increasing number of smokers believe that e-vapor products are as harmful or more harmful than the conventional cigarettes. So there's a huge communication challenge in the UK to get that public health message across.
We may well come back to that, but as soon as you've touched on it, can you just explain why you think that is the case? Who is driving that? Or failing to communicate the health benefits or potential health benefits?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, at least in part, the Tobacco Products Directive, of which captures e-vapor products, in many cases fails to distinguish between tobacco-containing and non-tobacco-containing products. And many of the restrictions within the TPD correspond to those on the conventional tobacco products as well. The TPD is not taking into account the scientific evidence base that supports vaping products either. So essentially what we've got is this conflation of tobacco and e-vapor products, which I think sends the wrong message to smokers in the first part.
Thank you. Yeah, Darren. Just.
Are you saying that the public are misinformed between the difference because of the TPD? I mean, surely the public don't really know what the TPD is.
No, but I think, for example, if we look at advertising within the TPD, a number of the restrictions that apply to conventional cigarettes also apply to e-vapor products. And I think the message that sends is they're one of a kind, I think, from the regulatory perspective. But I think what's also a serious contributor to this is the misreporting of scientific studies and the subsequent presentation in the media. I think it's having a measurable impact on consumer confidence, which urgently needs to be addressed.
Okay. Just one final question before I pass over to Bill Grant. Another inquiry we're conducting is into research integrity, where one of the concerns is that not all the findings of a particular research project is published. Will you be publishing all the findings, not just the ones that particularly support the stance you're taking in the start?
Yeah. And it's important, particularly on the clinical studies, that you register your studies before you even start doing them, so people can see that a study's being done, so people have a very good transparency and, okay, so the study's been done, it hasn't been published, why hasn't it been published, or no, it has been published. So, yeah, we've registered already that 1 year long clinical trial, and it explains exactly what we're going to do, where it's being done, and then we will publish as soon as we get to the end of it.
And from our side, we also utilise our science website, where we put not only our published studies, but we also put conference proceedings and other scientific data that we've accumulated, not only for scientists, but also tailored for lay audiences to really try and explain to the general public the science behind these products.
Fantastic.
If I may add, Mr. Chairman, so we're also taking an approach where we're transparently sharing all of our research, not just peer-reviewed publications, but also the source data, so that scientists themselves can take that data and come to their own conclusions. And we're doing this because we understand that there are enormous questions about research integrity because of the history of the industry. And people are asking questions all the time, same sort of questions that I asked before I joined the company. I came from the pharmaceutical industry. I worked in Cancer Research UK, and I had big questions about whether science coming from the tobacco industry could really be credible. But I have to say we've made a concerted effort to ensure that we're following all of the correct standards, good clinical practice, good laboratory practices, and that we're publishing and sharing the data so that people don't have to rely on trust. They can actually verify our data for themselves.
Very good. Sorry.
So yeah, just to add, so Imperial and at Fontem, we're committed to transparent research. We regularly present our findings at conferences where we seek dialogue from other scientists and critique of our work, which helps strengthen and development when we're working and developing other studies. And we frequently publish our research in the peer-reviewed literature, and that's all available on the scientific website as well. And we hope to have dialogue and questions from the scientific community on our research.
Great, thank you. Bill Grant.
Thanks very much, yeah. Morning. Touching testing and what testing has been done on the effect of devices relative to different temperatures, different nicotine strengths, and what's described as different puffing habits. Taking them all together, what research or what testing or studies have been done, and do any of these factors make any significant difference or impact on the health of the user?
Yeah, in the context of vaping products like e-cigarettes, temperature can do. So if the thing is overpowered and the temperature of the coil in the system gets too hot, then you get thermal breakdown of glycerol and propylene glycol, which can create toxic aldehydes. So for good devices, and it's another reason why we really need to make sure we've got good product standards in this space. If e-cigarettes overheat, you will get some of those toxic compounds coming through. And I think where the British Standards Institute started with this, they really are the first to start setting standards. Now that's gone to European level at CEN and also going to international level. It's going to be a really important area to make sure people can have confidence in whatever e-cigarette they're using, the temperature is being controlled. I think we're going to talk about tobacco heating products later, but there's also a thing there, the higher the temperature, the more toxins you get. So you do need to control temperature in tobacco heating products. On your second question, which is about nicotine strength, we have done some topography on this. So that's looking at the way people use the product at different nicotine strengths. And when you look at cigarette smoking, you get compensation. People, if they have lower nicotine, they over puff to get nicotine back up. That looks to be less happening in the studies that we've done, so less of an issue there. But temperature definitely is something that needs to be looked after.
I would second that. I think our studies also show temperature to be one of the critical variables, not only for e-cigarettes but also for the heated tobacco products we'll talk about later. The other consideration is the material selection. So there was a paper last week looking at metal ions in vapour. So I think making sure you're using the right material for the coil, for example, to ensure that metal ions aren't migrating to the vapour. These are critical considerations. So what goes into the device is as important as how it functions.
I think regarding the thermal breakdown products, clearly the temperature, making sure that the liquid's not overheating is a very important consideration. What our research has shown as well, that equally important is the good fluid dynamics within the system, to ensure that we have good flow of the liquid to the wick and to the coil, to ensure that we have good vapour generation. And through those learnings that we've got from our research, we've actually engineered out the old, what's called the sponge and cartomizer system. So you can think of a sponge full of liquid. When you squeeze it, the water or the fluid dries out, so you're left with a dry substance. And we've moved to free flow technology to overcome that. So we're reducing that thermal breakdown issues with our product.
Could I touch on the free flow technology? Does that make, sounds a terrible question, does that make the puffing easier? Is there less resistance to the user when they're endeavouring to inhale?
Yeah, so the idea being that we should have a consistent vapour delivered to the vapour, so it makes it a nicer experience for them. And just on the second point on the nicotine, I think you've got Dr. Lynne Dawkins presenting to the committee after this, and she's done some very nice work looking at the effects of different nicotine levels on puffing topographies. I think that would be quite interesting to hear from her.
If I may just add, I think one of the calls I have as a scientist is to ensure that smokers here in the United Kingdom can access better information about the range of different products that are alternatives, smoke-free products that are alternatives to cigarettes. But in order to ensure that consumers are getting the right information, it's critically important that there are standards, that there are standards to ensure that companies are using the right materials, that they have heating technology under control, under a wide variety of different use scenarios, so that we can ensure that what's delivered by, whether it be an e-vapor, e-cigarette product or a heated tobacco product, that the smoker is always inhaling what the manufacturer says they are going to be inhaling. So standards can play a really critical role in helping to ensure that consumers have a safe product and consumers can be informed about the relative health risk in an accurate way.
They take the panel to toxicity of the products or maybe harmful byproducts generated. How does this compare against nicotine replacement therapies such as gums or indeed patches? Have you done a benchmarking exercise or a comparator of the toxicity?
I mean, nicotine replacement therapies are designed to be medicinal and have very low levels of toxicant exposure. So, as I was saying, in that risk continuum, you know cigarettes are here, and the nicotine replacement therapy is going to be right down at the bottom. Yeah. And I think the Royal College of Physicians did a very good review a couple of years ago of the safety of nicotine replacement therapy. So both vapour products and tobacco heating products are going to have additional risks compared to that. Yeah. We just don't know exactly what that level is. We've got Public Health England estimating where it should be a residual risk of 5 or lower for vapour products. We won't really know for a bit longer, but there's likely to be some additional risk. I think if you compare to NRT, they're probably relatively similar. Compared to cigarettes, they're very different, both the vapour products and the tobacco heating products, I think, in terms of the likely risks that they're presenting.
So if I can just add, so Imperial Brands and Fontem Ventures, we published a clinical study in 2005 which compared an e-vapor product to NRT, and we were interested in looking at the safety profile of the vapor product relative to the NRT product. And we found that the vaping product had a very similar short-term safety profile to the NRT product. But what we found was that the e-vapor product in that study was able to reduce smoking desire and nicotine withdrawal symptoms more than the NRT product. And was also able to not only deliver nicotine in the same way as an NRT, but also provided some of those behavioural and sensorial aspects of the smoking experience. So the e-vapor product in that study was very well tolerated and looked to be a suitable alternative to smokers.
Just to add, we're actually in the process of a clinical trial addressing this exact question, and obviously too early to share the data yet. We haven't finished the study, but once we have, I'd be very happy to share the data with the committee.
Yeah.
I'll just add one last thing. I think we recognise that the best thing that a smoker can do is to stop using tobacco or nicotine products altogether. So we haven't necessarily focused on the risk profile of our portfolio of smokeless products versus nicotine replacement therapy, because the focus has been on showing the difference compared to ongoing smoking. I think here in the United Kingdom there are 7.6 million people who are still using combustible cigarettes on a daily basis, and so the public health emergency, if you like, is that we should encourage all of those to either quit tobacco and nicotine altogether or switch to a product that's a better choice than continuing to smoke. So that's the focus we've had.
I'm pleased to report that the questioner is an ex-smoker, and the next question relates to being I was an ex-fire officer, and the questions around evidence in America where some of these devices exploded and were a fire risk, and that's been noted and recorded in the United States. Is there any evidence or recorded events such as the ignition of the device, and have yourselves as producers or engaging manufacturers adapted the devices to combat that, to reduce that risk, or hopefully eliminate that? Is it a real risk? Basically?
Yeah, it is a risk. I think with any battery-controlled product, there is a risk of fire. Now, we take that risk very seriously, and we've done a lot of engineering work to put protective systems around the batteries that we're using in our products. And for example, for our heated tobacco product, I think we've been very successful. We've shipped more than 12 million kits worldwide, and we've never had a battery problem at all. But it's nevertheless something that, again, standards can help with to ensure that, that there is consumer protection, but it's perfectly possible from an engineering perspective to put the right controls in place.
And on that, certainly in Europe, we do have quite rigorous battery standards. And from our side, a lot of investment in making sure that the batteries we source meet those standards. I think that the problem is that some of the batteries that are available are not compliant with the European battery safety standards. And so we ensure that they do, whether that's vent protection, so they, if there's a failure, they vent properly and then transport. So that's the critical, to make sure the batteries that are used in products meet the current existing standards.
Yeah, and standards are clearly critical, but also you need to get good consumer information out there too. So we had, in our vaping business last year, about 2,000 consumer complaints. Around 50 of them were related to batteries, but even with that small amount relatively of the complaints, what was happening quite often was people were using the wrong chargers on the batteries. So and I think Public Health England were very correct in this, saying this could be a risk. It looks to be relatively small, but you need to get great consumer information out there to make sure they use as intended. They're using the product with the charger together to make sure that you don't add to those risks of a battery setting on fire.
So I think Public Health England in the report a couple of weeks ago highlighted that there's low incidence of this in the UK, but we take it very, very seriously. We should be following the manufacturer's instructions, using the correct charger, not charging overnight. But there's a real need for product standards in this area around battery safety, because our products, we're using lithium-ion batteries which have protection circuits, integrated circuits in there to stop short circuiting. There's venting mechanisms to stop the build-up of gases. But what we find is a number of products on the market do not comply with these. So what we find as well is people are connecting the wrong coil to the wrong battery, there's short-circuiting, and there's fire and there's explosion. So there's a real need for battery standards in this area. And the other issue that we face is that responsible manufacturers that are complying with battery standards and striving to have high-quality products, we're often perceived as having poor-performing products because we have inbuilt safety factors to our batteries so that they're not operating at maximum power. So you can think of it as a bridge designed to hold a 10-ton lorry, but it could actually hold 50 tons there. So there's a safety factor built into our products as well, where some of the other perceived more powerful devices don't have that. So we're kind of competitively disadvantaged in that respect for having high-quality products.
Yeah. If I could move on to suggesting we're an innovative nation, and there's a risk that we may tamper with some of these products, the heat not burn. Is there any evidence to suggest that we've seen people changing, not so maybe the design criteria, but the outcome, the intended outcome criteria of the device? Is there evidence that people enrich it or enhance the product, sort of mischievously, we might describe it.
So maybe I start with our heated tobacco product, IQOS. So we took this concern very seriously. We do know that human beings, not just here in the United Kingdom, but anywhere in the world, can be very innovative. And we set out really to ensure that we minimised, to the extent that we possibly could, the ways that people could adjust what the device would deliver. So we have encrypted the software, for example, so that it's impossible for somebody to, well, we believe impossible for somebody to hack the device, and we've employed professional hackers to try and overcome the protections we've put in place. And we're aware that ingenuity and technical ability increases over time, so we're continuing to monitor that and make sure that there's no way that the user themselves can do something to change the delivery of the device. And we're doing that because we know that the precise temperature that we're heating the tobacco at is very important in ensuring that we reduce the level of harmful and potentially harmful chemicals that are produced. So it's not in our interest to allow somebody to be able to adjust that, because then you don't have the reductions that are so important for the longer term risk reduction. So the focus is on making sure that there are controls in place and that the user themselves cannot interfere with that in a way that may be harmful for the product and the user.
Yeah. And from our side, our heated tobacco product, our current one, is what we call closed system. So the product comes pre-filled, so the user doesn't have to fill themselves. So you think of it like a cartonised e-cigarette. We don't have an open system where a consumer puts his own consumable in there. So that's how we control. Certainly to date, we haven't seen any evidence of consumers trying to manipulate, should we say, our heated tobacco product.
Yeah, no, actually closed systems are interesting. So our tobacco heating product is another closed system. So is our kind of vaping products, where you buy the cartridge and it's all sealed in. But clearly in vaping products, there are some people that are going and modifying their own, particularly in the open systems. And actually the cause of that is, the solution to that requires innovation from a technology point of view. So I think we're still on a journey with vaping products to needing a greater choice, more innovation in that sector. That's why, you know, in our R&D in Southampton, we have been bringing in technologists from other companies like Dyson to join us to try and figure out what's the next generation of vaping products. And that innovation can only really get out there with a lot of energy and support to come up with the next generation, which I think will be less able to be tampered with because there's been no need. They're actually sort of satisfying all the needs of the consumers. So innovation in the space is going to be continue to be critical. I think actually both on the tobacco heating product side and the vaping side, and more choice, which I think is really where we're coming to here, that not everyone is going to switch to a vaping product. Some will want a product like a tobacco heating product, some will like all tobacco products rather than smoking. So a range of innovations across that whole space I think are going to be really important. And that then gets rid of the temptation to tamper if you've got the satisfying product in the first place.
Yeah. May I just add, I think Dr. Proctor makes a very important point. I think particularly here for the United Kingdom, we've seen a plateauing in the number of smokers who are switching to electronic cigarettes over time. So I think it was something like 800,000 people switched in 2015, and last year it was something like 100,000. So we're in the risk that we've reached the maximum potential of electronic cigarettes. I hope that's not the case, but I think what that shows is that there's room for all sorts of different product innovations in the smoke-free product area. I think that's something that we're working as a company to ensure that we are offering choice and different types of technology that can suit each individual smoker's needs.
Just finally,
picking up on the still in journey, if you don't Proctor, where is that journey? Where's the future of the...
what direction is it? Very briefly, and I'll take a lot of time.
Yeah, no, very briefly.
What's the journey of these devices?
I think two ways. One, more satisfying, and safer. So I think that's where we're going. I think the coil and wick that's used in most e-cigarettes will become out-fashioned, and there'll be new ways in which you create a vapour without the breakdown of those the glycerol and the propylene glycol, but with greater satisfaction for the consumer.
Just to add to your question on the modification, so at Blue we've engineered out the foreseeable modification, so we have unique proprietary screws, threads, and our pod system. And I think on this topic that's quite important around the thermal breakdown and the kind of this dry puff conditions that we heard from Dr. Pelosa a few weeks ago at the committee. Future innovations in the e-vapor category are actually looking to remove the heat source entirely, so we could see the generation of an aerosol through high vibration ultrasonic vibrations, or through pressure systems like a deodorant can. So there's innovations all the time coming through. And
It's evolving.
Yeah, and what we'd like to see though is that the regulation actually encourages and fosters that innovation, so we can give the smokers what they're after.
That's very good. Just before I go to Martin, can I just ask Darren for a tiny little intervention?
Mental. I was interested in the point about hacking. Does that mean that these devices are connected, I assume, to one's mobile phones in order for there to be a connection? And if so, what data is being collected and why?
So some of the more recent devices that we have, there is what we call Bluetooth capability. And what's that's intended for is to help smokers to make the switch. So we know that when smokers first start using or switching to, for example, our heated tobacco product, that there's a period of natural adaptation that has to occur. You don't immediately turn from one day to the next and be able to use the product. So we're using this Bluetooth capability to, for example, count the number of sticks that the smoker is using, and to remind them to do things like cleaning, something that they wouldn't have to do when they're simply taking a cigarette out of a pack and lighting it. So encouraging them to do the steps that are required, that are innate to the technology, and also reminding them to do things like order products so that they don't run out and have to go back to combustible cigarettes. We're using it to kind of coach them through that adaptation period and encourage them not to be using combustible cigarettes and using only the heated tobacco product. So that's the focus of that type of technology.
Thank you. Just before I pass to Martin, to ensure we get the most out of this session, can I encourage colleagues to keep their questions tight and focused, and can I also encourage you to keep your answers as concise as possible? Otherwise, unfortunately, as often happens, we run out of time and don't get everything we want. So Martin's going to be an exemplar of this. Martin,
thank you. All right, I will make it very short and succinct. Turning it slightly on the head, do you think that there is a risk that e-cigarettes are going to do the opposite by renormalising smoking and taking non-smokers on the wrong way trip? Views first. Apparently very short and succinct views, but views first. Let's start with Moira.
The short, succinct answer is the data to date suggests otherwise, that if anything, e-cigarettes are a gateway out of smoking.
And I can add for heated tobacco products, which is the focus of much of our research, and we see very, very little interest from people who are non-smokers, and particularly in younger age groups. So looking at young adults, they're absolutely not interested in these products, and potentially because they contain tobacco, which is somewhat off-putting for non-smokers. So of course we understand that this is an area that we need to be very mindful of, and we need to be concerned about. We need to be monitoring in a post-market environment and surveying and checking, but so far the data we have to hand shows exactly what Dr. Jones says, that these types of products are a gateway out of smoking and not a gateway into it.
I think that's absolutely true. I think we should be absolutely clear that these are nicotine products still, so they should only be for adults, and they still will be addictive. And therefore all the protections for ensuring young people don't use these should be in place. And I think in the UK we should be comforted with the fact that we have very good surveys going on, particularly through people like Action on Smoking and Health, or looking at the situation as it changes year by year. And so far it looks like the vaping products aren't a gateway into smoking, but those surveys should continue so that we can keep an eye on the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a legitimate question to raise, but we're very encouraged by the UK data, which shows that never use of these products is around 1%. Which is comparable to never smokers using NRT in the UK. And particularly with the young people, one of the largest surveys that was ever conducted across the UK, and looked at data from Scotland and Wales as well, 60,000 pupils found that use of vaping products was negligible, and actually regular use was confined into those people that already smoked. So we're very confident that these products are getting in the hands of adult smokers only.
Right, and And those conclusions are based, as you say, on research from a variety of sources for that. To move on then, how do you go about designing the marketing of appeal to this? What inputs do you have to appeal to a very specific type of customer, i.e. the smoker that wants to, the smoker and ideally the smoker who wants to give up? So how do you go about doing that with the marketing?
So I'm a scientist, I'm absolutely not a marketing expert, but I can give you a broad view. I think we're very interested in ensuring that we have the opportunity to have targeted communications to smokers. We're not interested in broad communication opportunities. We're interested in attracting the right users, which is smokers who would otherwise continue to use cigarettes. So one example of that unfortunately we can't do here in the United Kingdom because of the laws that exist are things like pack inserts in conventional cigarette packs. We believe that would be a tremendous opportunity to be able to talk only to smokers and tell them about the existence of new products, new smoke-free products. And I think that's something that here in the United Kingdom would be a very simple thing to do that would allow marketing to exactly the right audience and not to the wrong audience.
I think I'd second that. I hate the caveat, I'm also a scientist. But my understanding is that at this point in time, targeted marketing, as Moira said, is not permitted, and that would certainly help, whether it is via pack inserts or direct communications to smokers and vapers.
Yeah, I mean, for example, in our Vape e-cigarette brand, we make sure that it's all adult verified when people are on the website. So you have to, through the company we use, have to have a passport number or a registered enrolment number. So you're going to have adults only on that site. But currently, since the laws changed after TPD was brought in, you can't give any proper communication related to the risks on those websites, even though you've already caught what is clearly an adult. So oddly, you can do some advertising on billboards, but you can't on this site where you've already got a clear target audience. So I think that wasn't the case before TPD came in, and the Advertising Association had gave good, sensible rules for that, and those have kind of gone backwards a bit. So that would certainly help if we start to look at that again later.
So from our perspective, we should be clear that these are for adult consumers only. I'm not a marketeer either, but it's very clear from Imperial that we want as many smokers to transition to our portfolio of vaping products as possible, to ensure that our products aren't getting in the hands or marketed to under 18s. We employ these age verification systems on our website as well. We have an international marketing standard that we expect all colleagues and markets to follow and to adhere to.
And just to flow on from that, are there any other changes in the current regulations that you think would assist this? You have the inserts and the specific targets to the groups. Is there anything else that concerns you about preventing you from achieving a better transition?
So I think the way I would look at it as a scientist is to say, okay, what opportunities are there to provide accurate scientific information to men and women who smoke in order that they can make an informed choice? And I think anything that's in the regulation that can help that can only be a good thing in helping encouraging smokers to either stop using tobacco and nicotine products altogether or switching to products that are clearly a better choice than continuing to smoke.
Yeah, I'll second that.
Yeah, I mean, on the communication side, definitely there's more that could be done. I think also TPD sets some standards both for the volume of a tank that you can use and the amount of nicotine that you can use in those, and that probably should be relooked. I mean, it was set, I think, as a precautionary basis quite quickly as those laws were coming in, so probably worth re-looking at that as well. And in the tobacco, the heated tobacco product space, I think we was at the beginning of trying to figure out, so what's the regulatory regime around that? I think it should be a separate category. I think we need to look at considering if we agree that these are reduced risk because they don't burn the tobacco, they don't create any smoke, any cigarette smoke, and then what should be the various regimes should set there, both on terms of advertising, what's the excise rates, how do we actually establish what makes a tobacco heated product. So at the moment they're under novel tobacco products, but there's more to be done there, I think, to really kind of carve that out as a category.
Can I just come in on that before you respond? But you still have the view that the precautionary nature of the regulations is right, that foundation.
Yeah, no, I think it was absolutely right, and I think the TPD regulations on as they apply to vaping products were reasonably proportionate. No, but I think, and they came because the vaping thing has moved so quickly in like 5-6 years, so, and that came quite early in what was happening there. So they were naturally precautionary because no one really knew what was happening with the marketplace, what was happening with the safety of the products. Mm-hmm. But we know more now, even in 2 or 3 years later, to the various surveys and go on to. I think we could relook and say, okay, have they been set exactly right, or are there some things that we should be able to tweak to give a bit more commercial freedoms, I think, to encourage their use more, and also encourage the innovation in that category, because I still think it has a journey to go.
Even before the epidemiological studies can possibly be made. I
think, because the epidemiological studies are needed for the precision of what the relative risk is, but they've got a lot of evidence to suggest these are safer than smoking now. So I think Public Health England and Royal College of Physicians and the data we've collected is pretty indicative that these are going to sit somewhere different from where cigarette smoking are. So if public policy is to try and encourage people to switch from smoking to these less risky products, then we probably need to look at how do we encourage that in various different regulatory regimes.
I think the concern that we have with the TPD for the regulations of vaping products is that it was bolted on to tobacco product regulation. And our view is that we believe that regulation should foster innovation in this category, and it should be based on compliance with robust product quality, safety and manufacturing standards, alongside a responsible marketing approach that ensures youth protection. So that's the angle that we would come from there. We are concerned with some elements of the TPD, as Dr. Proctor said. The arbitrary limits on nicotine strengths and bottle sizes is a concern, but also the notification process, the length of time, because that inhibits the ability to bring these innovative products to market sooner. And that's one of the features of this category, is innovation. And regarding the advertising, the Royal College of Physicians noted that these products should be promoted widely to smokers. So we would like to see greater advertising freedoms to get their communicate our brands to the smokers, to communicate the value proposition, the innovation of our products, and to essentially to be able to compete with the established tobacco brands.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Just following on regulation, should vaping liquids not containing nicotine be subject to the same regulations as vaping liquids containing nicotine?
Can I take that? Yes, from our perspective, yes, we believe they should. Consumers are still inhaling the vapour from these liquids, and we are also seeing, I believe in the UK, a situation which is called short fills, where consumers are buying a small bottle of nicotine-containing liquid and then adding it to basically an unregulated bottle of zero-nicotine flavoured liquid. And that, for me as a scientist, is a concern, because we do not know what is in that zero-nicotine flavoured liquid combination. So I think that based on the principles of consumer protection, that I think zero-nicotine liquids should be regulated the same, yes.
Yeah, my understanding is they're not at the moment, so they're more under the general consumer safety approach. And we, with Vape, sell zero nicotine closed cartridges as well as 18 milligram per mil cartridges, and we apply the same stewardship standards to those. So we're looking at what happens when they're used in the product. So I think maybe there's a reason that they should be regulated differently, but the consequence of that regulation shouldn't be there should be laxer product standards for them when there's still be generating emissions that people are inhaling. So there's a balancing act, I think, there in terms of ensuring we're not seeing untoward things happening with the zero nicotine liquids.
We would echo what Dr. Jones just said. these liquids are designed to be inhaled, and therefore they should be subject to the same rigorous standards as the nicotine-containing products. Through the UK Trade Association, some of the members have been doing some testing on these short fill liquids, and actually have found some undesirable chemicals which would be prohibited in the nicotine-containing liquids. So absolutely, we think that should be looked at. And actually, the French, they've actually said that the TPD would apply equally to nicotine and non-nicotine containing, and the Dutch are also looking at this. So we think if the liquid is intended for vaping, it should be subject to the same stewardship and standards as the nicotine containing.
Okay, so we're saying the same, not a laxer regulation.
No, we would apply the same standards.
Okay.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. Darren.
Thank
Jones.
you, Chairman. Do any of you smoke e-cigarettes?
I do occasionally.
Do you have a favourite flavour?
Yes.
Which
always. I'm not sure there are any e-cigarettes without flavours, but yes, I tend to choose mint.
Mint. I just wondered, because one of the things that we grappled with on a previous hearing was the research into the consequences of the flavourings in e-cigarettes. And I just wonder if anyone would like to answer about the research into that and the possible health consequences of the flavouring specifically, as opposed to the nicotine or the carrier agents.
Maybe I can start, because it's linked a little bit
right.
to the question you asked about the Bluetooth technology. So there is an adaptation period that smokers need to go to, and flavours can play an important role in helping them to adapt to this new type of product, which is whilst some of them are close to the taste and flavour of cigarettes, they're not the same. So we believe flavours are important in helping that adaptation. Nevertheless, we're taking extreme care to ensure that the flavours that we put in our products are toxicologically appropriate. So we go through a very long toxicological screening process before we approve a flavour for use in a given product type. But we do think that it's important that we can have flavoured products, because they do help smokers to make that transition and to make it more quickly than perhaps they would with unflavoured products. Now, I think some of the concerns about flavouring are more about the marketing of those flavours, how they're described, how they're characterised to vulnerable populations such as youth, and I think that's something that clearly can be regulated for. But I think flavours are helpful and necessary to help smokers, the intended audience for these products, make the switch in as short a time as possible.
I'd echo that, and this is one area I do believe that TBD2 has done a good job in the notification process. We have to provide the scientific information on the flavours that we add, the individual ingredients that we add to the liquids, and defend the use of those ingredients, not only at a qualitative level, what they are, but also the quantitative level, how much of each ingredient we add. And I think this is one of the things that I'm pleased to see from TBD2. It is forcing manufacturers to know what they're putting in their e-liquids, because I'm not sure prior to TBD2 everyone particularly knew what was going in.
Yeah, I think there's more that can be done, actually, on flavours. I think there are clearly some flavours that are already blacklisted. So there's a compound called diacetyl, which can lead to lung problems. So that's on a blacklist. But we know there's some other flavours that can break down to that compound. So what we do when we find that is we publish that research, but that needs to get into a product standard that then gets enforced. So, because flavours, if they're done correctly, should not add to the toxicological burden of the vaping device. And we've done testing where we've done with and without flavours, and you don't see a change in the toxicological profile, but some could. So we do need to be careful and ensure that we've got proper standards in place and enforced to make sure you don't get flavours that could cause health problems.
I think it's a good question. So you asked favourite flavour. What we find with vapors is something called flavour fatigue. That actually flavour variability is incredibly important for vapors. And there was a recent study suggested that vapors are changing. 64% of vapors are changing their flavours daily. So this mix and match and this availability is essential for this category. We see that flavours are important for attracting smokers to the category and retaining them in there to prevent relapse. That doesn't detract from concerns about flavours potentially being attractive to children. We would say there shouldn't be blanket bans on flavours per se, but responsible marketing approaches, and we'd be very happy to discuss an appropriate naming convention for e-liquids. It's unacceptable, the bubble gums and the cotton candies, for example. From a toxicology perspective, we've got professional toxicologists at Imperial and Fontem that are looking at every single ingredient that's used in our liquids. So we have 100% disclosure of the ingredients in our liquids. And they can do risk assessments to determine the appropriate levels in use in our products. And we actually mandate that all our flavour houses that we work with disclose that information to us.
And in terms of this non-nicotine version of the flavourings, am I right in assuming there's kind of a market of providers outside of the tobacco companies that are producing these flavouring liquids? And if so, as kind of an extension to the previous question, do you have concerns around the toxicological assessment of the flavourings from those companies when they're making those liquids?
Yeah, no, we do. I mean, we know, I know in my labs I've got professional toxicologists that spend their lives looking at these things, but I'm sure a lot of the manufacturers don't have access to that, which is why I think declaration of ingredients was important in TBD2, but we need to move a step forward to make sure not only is that being checked and it's accurate declarations, but also we start to weed out some of the things which may be of toxicological concern.
Also, in my experience from when I've spoken to some of the SMEs in the area, quite often there's a misunderstanding about what a flavour is. Some will think that they buy cherry flavour from their supplier, and that is the flavour, the ingredient. In fact, that in flavour may in itself have 10 or 20 ingredients that make up that cherry flavour. So there's also a bit of education in terms of what flavours are, coming back to this single ingredient to understand each single ingredient, whether it's suitable for purpose.
And just very lastly, is there anything from a public policy or regulatory perspective that would improve the blacklisting process for flavours that might have a toxicological impact? Or are you happy with the system as it is today?
No, it was more. I mean, I think we haven't really... So we've got basic standards in place, and I think the work that's being done now at international level and at European level through SEN will give more precision. It's looking both at device safety and emission safety. But then we need to, when that comes back into us, when that process is finished, and it should be finished in 2018, we've got to get some kind of enforcement regime around it too, to make sure that if there's a growing blacklist, actually we're checking against it to make sure that those aren't in any of the flavours in the marketplace.
So does that mean there's no enforcement today?
Well,
there's a voluntary blacklist.
It's a voluntary disclosure, and I don't know whether the MHRA have sufficient resources to look through that or to really check whether that's correct. Okay. But we also need to have a big enough blacklist. We've got a very simple blacklist at the moment, which needs to grow, I think, with some of these compounds, and then ensure that the enforcement agency have enough resource to be able to actually look at that and make sure we don't have those products on market.
Okay.
I think the issue is regarding, do some liquids already have these chemicals in there? In the absence of product standards, particularly around testing methods, you're comparing apples to pears because there's not one standard method. So one lab will use method A and one method B, so you might not detect the chemical. But we would agree that strict enforcement of product standards is absolutely essential, and that would form the basis of a bespoke regulatory framework, we believe, for these products.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Martin.
Thank you. I know we've had some contributions about the heat not burn, but just to address that specifically, according to the research, can you explain what the main difference between cigarette smoking and heat not burn is? Just put it on the record.
Maybe
Please, yeah.
I start, because I think we're probably furthest ahead in
Yeah.
terms of our development and assessment of heated tobacco products. So we're instead of burning tobacco, so tobacco in a combustible cigarette burns anywhere between 600 and 900 degrees Celsius, so very high temperature, and it's that high temperature that causes the production of the vast majority of the harmful chemicals that appear in cigarette smoke. When we're heating tobacco, though, we're heating it at much, much lower temperatures. So in our IQOS device, the temperature, the maximum temperature the tobacco can reach is 350 degrees centigrade, which is well below the temperature where combustion may start to happen. And the consequence of that is that we get a very significant reduction in the levels of harmful chemicals. So we see a 90 to 95% reduction in the levels of the harmful and potentially harmful chemicals. Now, we've we've taken that onwards from the laboratory, so we've looked at toxicological studies as well. There we see a greater than 90% reduction in toxicity compared to cigarette smoke in standard tests. And we've also done something called systems toxicology, which is looking at the very mechanisms by which smoking-related diseases are caused in the body. And there again we see tenfold reduction in the impact on those disease mechanisms for our heated tobacco product compared with cigarette smoke. Then, of course, we've gone on and done clinical studies in adult smokers. We've completed 8 clinical studies so far. And there we see that smokers are exposed to much lower levels of those harmful chemicals. In fact, they're exposed to levels that come close to the levels seen in smokers who stop smoking for the duration of the study. And that study, the longest study we've completed so far, we've done 2 over 3 months, which is very encouraging. We also see that things called clinical risk markers, so markers that show that you're at an increased risk of having one of the smoking-related diseases, they all move even in that short time period of only 3 months, which is very short for a health outcome. We see that they move in the same direction as the smokers who quit during the study. Now, ongoing now, we have this year-long study that I alluded to at the beginning. We'll have 6 months data released quite shortly, where we're looking at those clinical risk markers over the longer term. And we're very hopeful that we're going to see encouraging results, as we've seen with all of the studies that we've done. So I think as a scientist, I would say, don't focus on the fact that it's tobacco, because it's not tobacco that's causing the smoking-related diseases. It's the fact that it's combusted in cigarettes that causes the issue. Now, the products are not risk-free. They deliver nicotine. They deliver some residual levels of harmful chemicals, but those levels are much reduced compared to cigarette smoke.
Just one. Certainly, when we've looked at heated tobacco, temperature does seem to be the key here. Mm-hmm. We've looked at a number of devices that heat at different temperatures, and there does appear to be a correlation between temperature and what we would call vapour complexity, or the reduction in harmful constituent vapour, and also toxicological activity. The interesting thing is we find that no combustion is the key. Once you remove the combustion, it's almost like walking off a cliff. All the others, there is a correlation, but it's down in the 90s, between 90 to 99. The big difference is just that difference from combustion to no combustion. Then, when you go from the 350 down to almost room temperature, you're in the 90s, but there is a slight positive correlation.
Yeah, just to kind of shortly add to what's been said there. I mean, not all tobacco products, heated tobacco products, are the same. So we presented the Committee of Toxicity on a product called iFuse, which is a hybrid, which performs very much like an e-cigarette, but it has a tobacco cap in it. And that's warming to about 30 to 40 degrees C, so you're getting pretty much the same emissions you'll get from an e-cigarette from that. In our Glow product, which is only heats up to 240, then you are getting no combustion, and you're getting that reduction in the chemical emissions, which then translate, when you do clinical studies, to reductions in biomarkers of exposure.
I think, unlike e-cigarettes and vaping products, heated tobacco products contain tobacco, so there is a fundamental difference in these product categories. Unlike for the e-vapor product category, where there's a substantial independent scientific evidence base that supports these products in tobacco harm reduction, there is a lack of independent studies for the heated tobacco products. What the research seems to show, and our research would confirm, is that the emissions in the heated tobacco products are significantly reduced, and I think Public Health England acknowledged that, and the Committee on Toxicology. But whether that translates into a reduction in risk remains to be seen.
Yeah, just add something. I think another thing that we look at as scientists is not just this reduction in harmful chemicals and the ultimate impact that may have on health, which we believe will be very significant, but we also need to look at whether smokers can switch to this product. And we believe that heated tobacco products play an important role for many smokers, because the taste and flavour is much closer to the flavour of combustible cigarettes than e-vapor products can achieve currently. So we see very significant levels of complete switching to our IQOS products. So on the level of around about 70% of purchasers of the product are switching completely and are not dual using. So that's an important factor when you look at what could the longer term health outcome be, because eliminating the use of combustible cigarettes for each and every smoker is the most important thing. So we see two pillars to the success of a product. So reduction in risk, very significant, but then ability of smokers to be able to switch completely and not use combustible cigarettes.
Yeah, and I agree with Moira that, I mean, we need a range of products that are in this space, and that's vaping, I think, has a really important part to play. I think tobacco heating products has. I think all tobacco products have as well. And there was when I started off talking about the epidemiology, we do have all products we know are much less risky than smoking that currently are prohibited under TPD. So I think expanding that range across, giving smokers the choices to move to something that we are determined as being less risky, that may have different characteristics and different rituals to they have now, or may have similar ones, which is sometimes a driving force for people switching and staying, is you have not just nicotine equivalency, but also ritual equivalency and some of the sensations they've got really used to over many years of smoking that needs to be built into some of these innovative products.
So where's the big gaps then in the research with heat not burn?
I can take that. So I think that Dr. O'Connell mentioned independent research, and we believe independent studies on our products are extremely important. Now, the product is new. It's only really been on the market for a couple of years, so it's unrealistic to expect that there will be lots of studies already completed, because scientific studies take time. Nevertheless, we do see an increasing number of studies coming into the scientific literature, and interestingly, there was a conference last week, the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, where there were a number of scientific studies on the IQOS product were presented. There was a toxicology study. BAT have done a study, a clinical study, including our product. And these results so far are all going in the same direction as the results we've had, and we encourage more, and we would really like to see more here in the United Kingdom, because the scientific base here is obviously fantastic. So I think we would just encourage it, but it will take time, but so far things look very encouraging.
And there is a biological plausibility. Theoretically, these products should be have a reduced risk reduction because of the fact they're not combusting the products. What I also think are standards. We heard a lot about electronic cigarette standards. I think these products also need standards put around them, particularly to ensure that the products aren't combusting the tobacco under any particular use conditions. So definition of no combustion is actually quite an interesting one scientifically.
But they do require regulatory approval, don't they? And does that restrict, or do you find that a boundary to doing research? I was thinking sort of more behavioural research and stuff rather than product research.
No, I wouldn't see it as a boundary. I think this is really important. We've taken the scientific approach that we've taken over the last decade, because it made scientific sense, and we're using the information that we developed according to the principles that are used in the pharmaceutical industry, and we're sharing that scientific information with regulators. It makes perfect sense. There needs to be oversight. I think it's important for consumer confidence, so smokers can be assured that people have looked at the science and not just the companies. I think it's a very important process to go through, and we're going through this process in the United States right now.
But you're suggesting, Dr. Jones, that perhaps that should extend more to the actual product itself to ensure that the manufacturing standards are high.
I think they should be complementary. I think complementary approach.
From our research that we've done looking at the heated tobacco, we see that the tobacco blend of the tobacco consumable and the temperature of the device greatly influences the emissions. So what we have in this category, it's not homogeneous, so there's different ignition sources and heating systems as well. So that's slightly different to in the vaping category, where the principle is basically the same.
So it is fundamental, the potential health impact is very sensitive to the heat and the type of combustion that's used.
I would just add to what Dr. Jones said. I think the most important thing is not combusting. We see a very dramatic reduction as soon as you eliminate combustion, and then you're kind of working in the
10%.
Exact 10%.
And there's a clear scientific test that you can apply to show that you've got no combustion. So we've published on a 5-step scientific process that you go through to show you're not, for example, getting chemicals of combustion like carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen being formed, and other things in terms of looking at before and after. So that could be as kind of an easy thing to put into a product standard. So, okay, now this product range can be identified as being something which heats but does not burn the tobacco.
So is there an agreement on what is combustion, to turn your question around, Dr. Jones?
There's a scientific definition of what combustion is, the oxidative reaction. It's demonstrating no combustion, particularly in the tobacco matrix. And as Dr. Proctor says, you almost have to go through this 5-step process, looking at for reaction products of combustion. You can, as PMI has done, look to see if the device works in the nitrogen atmosphere in the absence of oxygen. So it's like a weight of evidence. No one study on its own will demonstrate it, but if you do several studies and put them together,
but an agreement could be reached.
Absolutely.
Can be reached on what amounts
And
to
they're
combustion.
simple studies. They're not like long-term, complicated clinical
exactly.
studies. They're simple laboratory studies that can be applied.
And we've shared our data on lack of combustion with a number of combustion experts across the globe, and one of whom was responsible for defining the fire safety protocols on the space shuttle. So we've had experts look at the type of evidence that would be required, and it's essentially the types of studies that Dr. Proctor mentioned. And I think these are not rocket science. They are simple to do and can provide a very helpful basis for product standards.
Sorry.
Looking at the development of policy around heated tobacco, what we would say in these combustion studies, it's very important that there's independent verification of those studies to confirm what our colleagues are finding.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Bill, we have approximately 10 minutes left of this session and 2 questions to get through. So if you can keep yours to about 5 minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Noting the regulatory framework, should the heat not burn products be treated in the same as conventional cigarettes, or does such a grouping fail to recognise the clearly different health impacts?
Yeah, no, I'll be very quick. I think they should be separated. I think because we're not burning, it's clearly a different product. So it's currently under the novel tobacco products. I think we need to see what that actually means. But yeah, no, it shouldn't be treated as cigarettes. It needs to be treated separately.
I agree. To be recognised as a subcategory on their own as heated tobacco products.
General consensus?
Well, I think the most important thing is differentiating from combustible cigarettes, and I think the range of smoke-free products that are currently available need to be treated differently to cigarettes when it comes to regulation standards, when it comes to communication opportunities. And I think the UK is fairly unique in terms of the way that you're looking at tobacco policy. You're being science-led, which as a scientist I think is very encouraging. And I think you're in a position here to be able to ultimately eliminate the use of combustible cigarettes. And we as a company stand ready to discuss with the government when that could be and what triggers would need to be in place in order for, as a scientist, for us to be comfortable that there wouldn't be unintended consequences to making a firm date for the stopping of sales of cigarettes. So, for example, introducing all sorts of different smoke-free products that comply with standards, that are a better choice than continuing to smoke, and having, let's say, for example, 50% of smokers already having switched to them, I think we would be in a position to sit down with government and agree, okay, when is the time that we can stop selling combustible cigarettes? And I think the UK is probably one of the most advanced countries in the world who could be in a position to do that in a very short space of time, which is really encouraging.
Just add very quickly that unlike the e-vapor product category, which has had public health endorsement, Royal College, Public Health England, Cancer Research UK, no regulator or public health body has concluded that heated tobacco products yet are reduced risk. And to that end, we believe that they should be regulated alongside their traditional counterparts until such time.
Just to note, the Committee Toxicity, when they reviewed the data, both from Philip Morris and ourselves, did believe that tobacco products are likely to be less risky than conventional cigarettes on the data they've got so far. What they said, they couldn't precisely put it in a place compared to e-cigarettes or NRT.
That remains to be proved if you're reviewed that it's accurate, but you think that will evolve in time. Moving on, Public Health England had a recent report suggesting a report on alternative smoking products, suggesting that e-cigarettes should be made available on prescription as a cessation or stop smoking treatment. Would you agree?
Make this really short, yes.
We would
It's
agree
going to
with,
build the X factor. Is that 4 years?
we would agree with any measure that can help smokers to switch if they're not going to quit altogether. Any measure that can help them switch to an alternative product, smoke-free product, is important.
We would support the wide availability of products, e-vaping products to smokers, whether that's via the medicinal route or through the consumer route. We support a twin-track regulatory approach. But one thing I'd just add is, from our experience, that smokers don't see themselves as patients. And actually the innovation in the product availability is one of the key features to the smoker in this category.
On a similar theme and linked to maybe business or funding stream opportunities for companies, and that brings the market in, do you have any plans to apply for a medicines licence for any of your e-cigarette or heat-not-burn products to make them available on prescription via general practitioners? Do you see that as a way forward?
Yeah, no, well, we've had 2 license applications in, both for a product called Vogue and a product called Evoke. And that was some time ago, and we got to a place where we actually decided we needed to focus upon our vape brand Vipe, and also bringing these tobacco heating products to market. So we're not currently doing that through the medical license route.
From our side, we've certainly looked at it. The concern we have is, other than the cost, and it's mainly the time. These products are innovating and changing so fast. If you run for a medicinal license approval, essentially you freeze the product at the start, you have to have the same product at the end. And by that time, particularly in today's environment, the other products have just evolved so fast. Your product's out of date by the time you reach the other end.
Cool. What Dr. Jones said, we had some constructive dialogue with the MHRA to explore this, and we would say that there needs to be a fast-track process if this is going to be explored, because by the time you get the licence and market the product, the technology is redundant. And there's also the issue about reduction in consumer choice and flavours as well that would need to be explored.
Am I sensing that's a not now unless the criteria changes? Is that what it's picking up?
We're continually looking at it. We don't have a firm plan as yet, and I think what Dr. Jones mentioned in terms of innovation is one of the key factors in making the decision. But certainly we'll continue to monitor how we think that we could use that route to bring products to smokers.
Very briefly, and it's a wicked question, do you see a financial incentive into your companies to go that particular route for the distribution of your product?
I don't think it's necessarily a financial incentive. I think what is important is this regulatory review, and I think we're availing ourselves of the regulatory process in the United States at the moment, which is not a medicines regulation, but it is a very well prescribed regulatory route that means that the regulator is looking at our science and coming to a decision about it. And I think that's what we would encourage in any other country is some way that we can have a regulatory authorisation so that consumers can be confident about any information about the product and its
consumers
relative
and
risk.
potentially GPs can be confident in what they're...
Absolutely.
Likewise, I don't think there's a financial behind it. I think it's more a case of opening up another avenue by which consumers could have access to these products.
Yeah, I agree.
That's fine. That's me, Chip.
Just before I pass over to Darren, just for clarity, could you confirm whether or not your product has to be medically licensed before, or any of your products would have to be medically licensed before a GP could prescribe them?
Well, I think I'm not super clear. I don't live, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom anymore. I live abroad, but I'm fairly aware of regulation, but not super clear. But I think there are two roles that a physician can play in the life of a smoker. First of all, is the prescription route, but then there's also the lifestyle advice route. And I think what Public Health England has done here in the UK has been extremely important for physicians for the latter. So helping them to give smokers the right lifestyle advice about the choices they're making, and to give them information about electronic cigarettes, heated tobacco products in that kind of format is important, and may be just as important, if not more so, than the medicinal route.
Yes. I have a similar understanding, likewise I also now live abroad, but I think the lifestyle choice or guidance, as in stop smoking services in the UK, are advising people who wish to stop smoking to try e-cigarettes if they want to do so. My understanding for a prescription, that would have to be for medicinal purpose I suppose it's about cost as well, as much. And TB2 does say that electronic cigarettes for medicinal purposes should be subject to MHRA licensing.
Okay. Nothing further to add, don't.
I'll just add that actually what was quite significant at the end of last year was the British Medical Association's position on e-cigarettes. They actually came out, following review of the evidence, very supportive of the category and its great potential. And I think on the whole medicinal topic, if we look at the UK vaping population, we've got 3 million vapers, former smokers and current smokers, of which half have switched to vaping, and that's not cost a penny to the taxpayer. So that, it's quite a significant public health achievement.
Thank you very much. And finally, Darren Jones.
Just two very quick questions. One on the profitability of the different products for your businesses. If you could just explain to the committee what the different profitability would be from combustible and e-cigarettes and heat not burn, and what that might look for you now and in the future. And then secondly, excise duties, whether you've made any representations or views on excise duty regulation around e-cigarettes and heat not burn. Who'd like to go first?
Yes, sir. So I'm a scientist, so I'm absolutely not an expert in fiscal matters nor profitability, as my husband will attest. I think if I take the last question first, which was about excise tax, I think in general, as a scientist, I would look at it and say, well, it makes sense for excise tax to match risk. So high-risk products should have high tax. Low-risk products should have low tax. And I think on a very simple basis, that's how I would look at it. In terms of profitability, I probably will be told that that's commercially confidential, but if the committee felt it important, then we could offer some information in confidentiality. But I'm certainly not an expert in that area.
Likewise, I'm not an expert, but I'm very happy to take that question back to my colleagues in the office and ask them to submit to the committee some profitability. In terms of excise tax, I understand the UK e-cigarettes are already subject to VAT, and we don't believe that there's any need to do anything in addition to that. Heated tobacco products, as I say, we believe should be subject to their own bespoke taxation under tobacco products, which is commensurate to the risk reduction potential of these products.
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I'm going to say something anyway. It's my understanding is that last year our revenue from next generation products about 2%. We're expecting to be at 3 to 5% this year. We have an ambition by 2030 to be 30%, and by 2050 to be 50%. So it's a ever evolving thing. That was only going to happen if we continue to innovate and we get the regulatory opportunity to bring these new products to market. On the question of excise, yes, we made representations in relation to the tobacco heating products. We do think there should be a different regime to cigarettes, weight-based and at a lower rate than for cigarettes. And for e-cigarettes, for vaping products, we think VAT is enough.
Feel free to say you'll need to check, but you talked about revenue. What about profitability between the different products?
That's where you got me as a non-expert.
Similarly, I'm a scientist. What I would say from the Imperial side is that the money from the tobacco business generates the funds to invest into the NGP side of the business. And as we get more smokers to switch to blue, into our vaping products, Imperial will transition, and the NGP part of the business will become a bigger material part. Regarding the excise, we're very clear that vaping products don't contain tobacco, and therefore they shouldn't be excised as tobacco, and it's very important that the affordability of these products is maintained so we can get more smokers to transition across. And regarding the heated tobacco excise, Imperial and Fontem set out their views in the written consultation to the Treasury just before Christmas, I think it was. And from our perspective, in the absence of public health endorsement of the heated tobacco category, we believe that heated tobacco should be taxed alongside the traditional conventional cigarettes.
For the purpose of this committee, we're only primarily interested in the scientific basis of policy, but it's just interesting to understand the commercial drivers around it, and also whether there's any competitive arguments in drivers in the arguments that you're making, perhaps between different products. So that was very useful, thank you. But if there's further information you want to write to the committee about afterwards, I'm sure we'll be happy to receive it.
Thank you very much, and of course thank you very much indeed for your very open and insightful answers this morning. That brings to an end the first session. Thank you. And we're going to move straight on to our second panel. We do appreciate your attendance today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Order. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this second panel session this morning on our inquiry into e-cigarettes and reduced risk tobacco products. Perhaps for the record you could state who you are and which organisation you're representing this morning.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynne Dawkins. I'm an Associate Professor at the Centre for Addictive Behaviours Research at London South Bank University. I'm an experimental psychologist, so I've been working in nicotine and tobacco research for over 20 years now, and on electronic cigarettes since 2009.
Okay, thank you.
I'm David Harrison. I'm a professor in the University of St Andrews in pathology and also in Edinburgh. I'm here on behalf of the Committee on Carcinogenicity, which is a sister committee to the Committee on Toxicity that we've already heard about. My general interest is cancer biology, experimental cancer biology.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Perhaps, Professor Harrison, I can start with you. You mentioned there the Committee on Toxicology. Could you just tell us what the findings of the committee have been on, or what work they have done on e-cigarettes and heat-not-burned products?
So there are three committees related: toxicity, which is the one we're talking about; carcinogenicity, which is particularly cancer; and mutagenicity, which is causing mutations. So they've worked together. They have completed a piece of work on heat-not-burn. They are just beginning really to look in depth at e-cigarettes, so they haven't got conclusions, although they have gathered some evidence of that. In terms of conclusions, on the heat-not-burn to start with, I guess a lot of the conclusions that we've already heard we would agree with in terms of standardisation and methodology, etc. Two of the big ones are, one is what is the importance of combustion of tobacco, and the other is the centrality of nicotine. And those are interesting. In terms of combustion, we know that tobacco is a group 1 carcinogen. It causes cancer whether or not you burn it. So anything that has tobacco in it is going to be somewhere between those two, likely. So combustion is extremely important. We did review data at length, and we found that overall there was about a 90-95% reduction in cancer-causing chemicals. Some disappeared altogether, some were reduced by only a half. So there's clearly an interest around what's actually happening at the chemical level. In terms of nicotine is clearly important. Dr. Dawkins is an acknowledged expert, of course, in addiction, but of course many of the chemicals that are causing cancer are not nicotine. And indeed, in the case of e-cigarettes and the work that's beginning, there are other things ingested or inhaled, particles, including metals, solvents, flavorings, as we've heard, that actually we need to assess as well. So in terms of conclusions on heat-not-burn, COT have recognised there is a risk. We don't know the answers, and their job is not, in a sense, to advise other than to say there is a risk. There is a risk. It can't be quantified. It does appear to be less than burning cigarettes, but the effect of that is not known. In terms of e-cigarettes, it's just beginning. but it's broader look than just nicotine. It's particles, it's metals, it's volatile organic compounds. So it's a more complex ask, in a sense, looking at that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, on the heat not burn, what are the potential harmful compounds? Are they readily identifiable?
So they are, and the companies, and we've heard from them, have done extensive studies. They haven't found anything new, which is important. So it's exactly the same chemicals that you would find with cigarette smoke, combustion. And indeed, some of those chemicals do not require combustion to be available, such as nitrosamines. So the combustion is about the quantity of chemical released and the shift of the balance. But the chemicals are essentially the same as other chemicals you would expect from cigarette smoking that have the potential to cause mutations and ultimately cancer.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dawkins, welcome. We're going to come on to your experiments with different strength e-cigarettes a little later. But you highlight that the more someone consumes e-cigarettes, just as a general point, the more formaldehyde type chemical they absorb. Why is that a problem? And how does the risk compare with conventional cigarettes?
Okay. I mean, I want to start by just saying, compared to conventional cigarettes, the levels are much, much lower. We haven't done an exact comparison, but they are much, much lower. We've looked at formaldehyde in two ways. So first of all, we've looked at a biomarker of formaldehyde in the urine of participants. And we've also looked at formaldehyde and other aldehydes, which are known human carcinogens, in the aerosol. But what we've done uniquely is to capture the puffing patterns that vapors engage in when they're using different strength nicotine e-liquids, and then replicate those puffing patterns with that same device and the same nicotine concentrations to generate the aerosol, and then trap it to analyse the potentially harmful compounds. So there's two levels. There's the biomarker work, which is quite novel and is not a very well validated assay, so we would like to see that replicated. And then there's the more robust, well validated formaldehyde found in the aerosol. But again, as I say, far lower levels than tobacco smoke.
Fine, thank you. So I think the point, just correct me if I'm wrong, but that formaldehyde is a carcinogenic, and so therefore any absorption of it is potentially risky.
Yeah, formaldehyde and acetaldehyde are known human carcinogens, but it's the dose that's important. We don't know at this stage. I mean, maybe others do. I'm not sure if there is a cut-off at which point we can say this level will translate into development of cancer. No. So we don't know over the longer term what kind of levels of repeated exposure are going to have an impact on health risk. Okay.
So one of the features of both e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products is the ability, or the difference perhaps individual products have in the amount of voltage or energy or power that they generate, and therefore the temperature at which substances are heated. Has your work, either of you, looked at the differing effect of temperature on both the products, both the groups of products?
Yeah, I'll start with this. So we know that aldehydes are formed when the solvents in e-liquid are overheated, so the vegetable glycerin or the propylene glycol. And there have been reports that extremely high levels of aldehydes can be found when the liquid is overheated. It's also been argued that under normal circumstances, vapors would be able to detect that overheating. They experience an aversive taste, so therefore they would avoid using under those conditions. So again, it comes back to the importance of using realistic ways of vaping. So in our work, we've looked at two different things. So we've looked at nicotine concentrations in e-liquid, and in another study we've allowed users to adjust the power in some conditions or to keep it fixed in other conditions. And there's an interaction between the two. So when vapers are given a lower nicotine concentration e-liquid and they're allowed to adjust the power, they increase the power, and then that is associated with an increase in aldehyde exposure.
Okay, thank you.
And I think many of the, as I've said before, COT are just beginning to look at e-cigarettes, but many of the third and fourth generation devices have very little literature published. Yeah. A lot of the early studies on the first and second generation devices actually didn't specify voltage, temperature. So there's a real dearth of information. And even where you have that information, it's not always easy to compare between studies. So I think what Dr. Dawkins is saying, there is work emerging that temperature is a factor. In terms of heat not burn, 350 degrees down to 30 degrees, we know in both settings there isn't combustion, but as I've said, you will still be releasing some potentially harmful chemicals, albeit in smaller amounts. But actually those comparative studies haven't been done, or if they have been done, the methodology is so disparate that it's actually very difficult to compare one study with another.
So still a lot of work to do in that area. Okay. And who should be doing that work?
Well, a lot of it, I think, probably should be done by industry, and some of the data that COT reviewed was top rate in terms of quality and academic excellence. It was absolutely first rate, but clearly public reassurance may require some of that to at least be confirmed out with industry.
Okay, thank you. And finally, before I hand over to Damien, one of the features of conventional cigarettes is the second-hand smoke, the trail that drifts off. That led to greater control on where one could smoke cigarettes. Have you done any work on the potential of second-hand vapour, smoke, whatever you wish to describe it as, from these two types of product?
So again, early days, but reviewing literature on e-cigarettes, some studies in closed rooms will show as much nicotine or perhaps half as much nicotine in the air from an e-cigarette as from a conventional cigarette. So there is a significant exposure, potentially. Again, very difficult to comment how real that is because of methodology. Particles is another, where metal particles have been detected in ambient air. So one of the areas that COT is looking at is actually bystander effects. With e-cigarettes or with heat not burn, again, there is a similar issue. Everything is reduced compared to cigarette smoke, but bystander effects are again something to be aware of, though one would expect that the dose would be commensurately less than for cigarettes. Okay,
thank you. Did you wish to add anything, Dr. Dawkins?
My understanding of the reading of the literature, and this is not something I have a great deal of expertise in, is that the nicotine levels found in the aerosol of electronic cigarettes just dissipate quicker and are generally at much lower levels than tobacco cigarettes. Also, the studies that I've read anyway show that generally levels of potentially harmful compounds were below levels, below the occupational safety levels in homes and vape shops, but there hasn't been a huge amount of research done in that area, so
I mean, there is a huge spread, and the trouble with detecting very small amounts is you tend to collect samples, and actually that collection itself changes the balance of what you then find. So it's a real mess of an area.
I think it would be useful to do work on other individuals who live with vapors, perhaps, and look at biomarkers of exposure in those individuals.
Thank you. Useful. Damien Moore.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Dr. Dawkins, in your written submission, you tell us about your experience with having e-cigarettes with different nicotine strengths and how that influences users' puffing behaviour. Could you briefly recap for us the essential conclusions from those studies?
Yes, okay. So we've done a couple of studies, both in the lab and outside of the lab, using kind of real-world puffing patterns. So we were interested in what happens when vapors switch to using lower nicotine concentration e-liquids. So using an experimental design, we've allocated people to use a high level on one occasion and a lower level on another occasion. So 24 milligram versus 6, for example. And we measured their puffing patterns. In one study, we measured nicotine delivery. We looked at their subjective effects of satisfaction and craving reduction. We then mimicked those puffing patterns under the low and the high nicotine e-liquid conditions in a separate laboratory using the same device to generate aerosol, to look at the carbonyl compounds in the aerosol. So we found basically in both the laboratory condition and outside over a longer duration of 4 weeks that using a lower nicotine concentration e-liquid in the same device resulted in compensatory behaviour. So this is commonly seen with tobacco smokers when they switch to using lower nicotine yield cigarettes. So vapers will increase their puff number, they increase their puff duration, and they consume a great deal more e-liquid. In a second study, where we allowed vapers to either keep the power fixed or to be able to adjust it as they saw fit under certain conditions, 70% adjusted the power upwards when they were using a low nicotine concentration, and only 30% did so with the high. So we saw on average, when people are using a lower nicotine concentration, they compensate both in terms of their puffing behaviour, but also by changing the power on the device, by increasing the power on the device. And a combination of those two things seems to be associated with greater exposure to carbonyl. So I think the key message there is not to encourage vapers to be switching to using lower nicotine concentrations. In fact, perhaps counterintuitively, using a higher nicotine concentration would result in less puffing. The nicotine delivery still seems to be much better with a higher nicotine concentration.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Harrison, has the Committee on Toxicity done any evaluation of the effect of different puffing patterns in response to different nicotine strengths?
It hasn't, and Dr. Dawkins is leading the field in this way. There's very little published work on that. I think the belief is probably that stronger nicotine strength will reduce puffing, and that's being experimentally confirmed, but COT hasn't formally reviewed any reviews on that subject.
Okay. Is there any evidence on what strength of e-cigarettes or heat-not-burn products as most likely to help those trying to give up conventional cigarettes?
It's actually quite difficult to answer whether there is a direct effect of nicotine content, particularly with, I can't say so much about heat-not-burn, but particularly with electronic cigarettes. The nicotine delivery depends on the user behaviour, it depends on the propylene glycol to vegetable glycerin ratio, it depends on flavourings, it depends on the device type, the power, and so many other things. However, saying that, and with those caveats in mind, there is some evidence to suggest that higher levels of nicotine are better for quitting. Dr. Farsalinos in Greece just asked vapers about this, and they reported they had to use high concentrations to quit, but then they reduced over time. My colleague Catherine Kimber, who was one of the co-authors on our submission, has also shown that higher levels of nicotine compared to a low level using the same device was associated with better craving relief and with better quitting over 6 months. So more people were able to quit with the high nicotine concentration e-liquid. That was only a study of 70 smokers. So obviously more is needed. We can look at the evidence from nicotine medications as well, from nicotine replacement therapy. Clearly nicotine is important because compared to placebo, hundreds of randomised controlled trials have shown that nicotine content, NRT, is better than placebo. And there's also some evidence that using a combination of nicotine replacement therapy products, a patch and a gum or and a lozenge, can increase cessation success.
Okay.
I don't think that data exists for the heat-not-burn. In fact, one of the issues with heat-not-burn is when we talk about these reductions, what are we actually comparing? And it tends to be standardising the amount of nicotine consumed. So in fact, these numbers that we've heard about where anything from 40 to 95% of chemicals are reduced is on the basis of assuming a standardisation to the normal cigarette, whatever that is. So we haven't got evidence that goes beyond that to say what would be a suitable replacement.
Okay. The 20 millilitre cap on e-cigarette comes from the EU directive. What scope is there for changing that after Brexit?
I think that's for you to say rather than me. But, First of all, I'd like to say that there is no rationale for that cap. I mean, I think it was mentioned earlier that there wasn't so much evidence around at the time the TPD Article 20 was being created. So it seems arbitrary to me. There is no evidence for increased harms of nicotine with levels above 20. So in the absence of that evidence, and in the light of research by our group that shows that actually if you reduce, you compensate, that's costly financially because you're using more e-liquid, and it may also come with a health cost if increased exposure translates to long-term health risk. So I've got a number of other points to make on this, actually. So at the time of the TPD, just before the implementation, Action on Smoking and Health conducted a survey on the number of people using above 20 milligram per millilitre. It was 9% at the time, so a minority, but still a significant number of people. Over time, people are... Sorry, no, let's come back to that. These are vapors. I think we've got to remember that we're also wanting to appeal to smokers. And for smokers, I think higher levels are likely to be important. The ASH study also showed that half of smokers who had tried electronic cigarettes didn't find them satisfying, didn't find they reduced their craving, so therefore gave up using them. For those smokers, transitioning higher levels of nicotine may be quite attractive. High levels of nicotine are not necessary in the more sophisticated devices, the high powerful modular systems, which may be why over time vapors are reducing the nicotine concentration in their e-liquid. But not everybody wants to use these large devices with higher power and lots of vapor. Another study we conducted where we asked smokers, which device would you use if you had a choice, a small cigarette-like device or a pen-like, fountain pen-like device? 50% said I'd prefer to use the smaller cigarette-like device. So many people do want a discrete device. They don't want lots of vapor, and those type of devices, because they're less powerful, they aerosolize the solution less effectively. You do need the higher nicotine concentrations. And one more point, if I may.
Please.
I think also, in general, the cap on nicotine concentrations is just sending the wrong message that nicotine is problematic, is addictive. Further to that, you slap an e-cigarette, a health warning on e-cigarettes that says nicotine is a highly addictive substance. Yeah. That's sending the wrong message, that it's nicotine that's the problem, it's smoking that's the problem, not nicotine.
Although nicotine isn't a highly addictive product?
Well, the addiction relates to the delivery mechanism. So addiction delivered from a tobacco cigarette, yes, indeed, is highly addictive. It's the speed of the delivery. Cigarette smoking is the fastest way of delivering nicotine, but it's also the other compounds that are added to tobacco to facilitate nicotine delivery. There's a chemical known as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that breaks down, that stops dopamine, a brain chemical responsible for reward, being broken down. So there's other factors in tobacco smoke alongside the nicotine delivery that maintains and facilitates addiction.
Okay, thank you. Just one final point from me before I pass on to Martin is just to make absolutely clear, the pattern amongst established vapors of starting off high and then dropping down, is there any health benefit additional health benefit from reducing the amount of nicotine in the liquids that you use, or is it a perceived health benefit?
I think this is a perceived benefit. I mean, this is anecdotal evidence from my discussions with vapors. I'm trying to wean myself off nicotine. I don't want to transfer onto another product. It's still maintaining the addiction. A couple of studies, one by Jean-François Etta and an unpublished study that we have conducted, has shown that over time, although vapors reduce the nicotine concentration in their e-liquid, their cotinine levels, which is a marker for nicotine intake, remain very stable. So this is consistent with what we've shown in the lab, that people compensate. They just puff more, they puff longer, they use more liquid. So I wouldn't say there's any health benefit.
Okay, and for someone vaping with no nicotine in a liquid and with a high content. Is there any additional health benefit there?
Well, the nicotine is not the harmful component. So obviously vaping is less harmful than smoking, but any harms appear to be associated with the flavours and the heating of the solvents.
Fine. Thank you very much. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. What is the harmful effect of nicotine then on the human body? What is the effect of nicotine on the human body?
Well, nicotine is a mild stimulant, so it has an effect on blood pressure and heart rate. But for most individuals, this doesn't seem to be problematic. This is why nicotine is licensed as a medicine by the MHRA in nicotine replacement therapy products, and indeed is safe for use in pregnancy. There is some literature that nicotine might be harmful to the developing brain in adolescence, but those findings come almost exclusively from animal research. So it's very difficult to extrapolate from that to humans.
Yeah.
And we don't see any evidence that there are, lots of adolescents with difficulties from using nicotine. It's difficult because it's hard to isolate the nicotine from the smoking as well.
So nicotine in animal experiments we've heard about tends to be large dose. There is some evidence, for example, in mice that mice may metabolize nicotine differently, and there are recent studies suggesting that therefore e-cigarettes are dangerous, but actually that may be a mouse specific, so we should stop mice using e-cigarettes. So there is evidence of acute injury to the lining of blood vessels, for example, and there's some evidence, it's not that strong, that nicotine can be damaging to people who already have cardiac failure. But actually I think these are fairly marginal compared to the real damage related to cigarettes, which is tobacco.
Yeah.
And in particular it's mixtures, it's not a single chemical. It's mixtures, and nicotine may be a part of that, but actually it's those other chemicals that are really doing the heavy work.
Do you think we know all we need to know about the effect of nicotine on the human body? Or, we always want to know more, but are you satisfied that we know enough for you to have answered the way you have about nicotine compared to tobacco with the multitude of chemicals and the mix that's in there?
I think there's still work to be done there because it's, the effects of nicotine have been conflated with smoking for so long, and I think there may be different effects depending on the nature of the delivery. But I think that's all I could say on that. I'm not an expert in that area.
I think that's probably true. If nicotine is encouraging you to engage in habits which expose you to other toxic substances, then yes, we should be doing more work. But I think the body of evidence is that nicotine is not by any means the most harmful product.
So is there to sort of move on slightly from that, when you compare nicotine patches and gums, which you suggested that people might use one or more, is the academic interest, I suppose is the way I want to phrase this, is that in the nicotine hit? Is that in the amount of nicotine when you're talking about low nicotine requiring more frequent puffs? So actually the nicotine is a guide, I suppose, to the body's desire. So the high nicotine satisfies quicker, therefore there's less, therefore inherently, if there's anything better or worse for you, it's less damaging. Would that be true? Or is that a true conclusion of what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So are your concerns with regard to e-cigarettes actually as much to do with all of the other materials that are involved, the metals, the other particulates and things like that? That's where, in your opinion, is that where the potential long-term dangers lie?
I think the Committee on Toxicity want to address that because, to be honest, that's the new part of the picture. There's so much known about nicotine. It's the potential for metals, for solvents, for flavourings that have been previously used but have never been inhaled. That's actually where the interest with e-cigarette risk assessment lies.
The risk assessment comes from.
I agree.
You agree? That's as far as I can go with this.
Thank you. Darren.
Thank you, Jeff. Two final small questions. Am I right in suggesting that the bulk of the evidence on e-cigarettes, heat not burn, is focused on in vitro and maybe mice testing, and that we're just starting to get into the clinical studies with real people. Is that right?
So the big challenge with epidemiology, of course, it's long term. It can take 20 years to get lung cancer if you smoke. So the real studies, the real world difference is going to be, will we be able to tell in 20 years? Now we're trying to model from what we know that even very small exposure, small numbers of cigarettes smoked can make a difference in large epidemiological studies. So there's parallel work trying to model, well, if we've reduced the number of chemicals, have we reduced the risk? But I think the message is that animal experiments don't actually give a very good guide. So just because we've taken out half the chemicals, 3/4 of the chemicals, doesn't actually necessarily mean we've taken out half the risk or 3/4 of the risk. So the only way to find that is real-world experience, and that's tough and it takes time.
So there are no risks in an overemphasis on non-clinical trials beyond the ones we can't control, such as they just take a long time to do?
There are other risks, and there are potential biomarkers. We've heard the term before, markers that might say something's going to happen, but they tend to be fairly low sensitivity in terms of these long-term consequences. So there are real challenges in gathering this data prospectively.
I assume on the behavioural side, it's a slightly different story because you're doing behavioural studies with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a kind of a restriction therefore on the conclusions you can make on the behavioural side because you're waiting for the epidemiological studies on the toxicology side to catch up?
Well, I think that on the behavioural side, we can inform those lab-based studies by saying this is the way people use. Although there's huge variation in the way people use because it depends on the device, the vehicle, the nicotine concentration and so on. But there have been so many studies that have made conclusions based on unrealistic setups and unrealistic puffing patterns. So I think that's where the behaviour can actually inform the lab-based work.
And do you find that your conclusions are doing that?
It's early days. We've only recently published these, and our second paper is still under review, although hopefully it'll be out soon. So it's early days, but I think we need to just make this more widely known, and hopefully this will happen.
Okay, that sounded very diplomatic, but the message has gone out to look at your behavioural studies when doing clinical studies.
But actually, having heard the speakers before, if I may, they all talked about the need for standardisation, and that's not just devices. Some of the early ones of which were pretty ropey, and people were inhaling lead, for example. But there's a real need for standardisation. So in terms of experimental design, I think it's essential that that's actually prescribed, because otherwise data is well-nigh meaningless because it has no relevance to the real world and it cannot be compared to anything else. So people make claims that are either scaremongering or falsely reassuring with no real validity. So I think standardisation is a very important message to come out from this.
Yeah, that's quite important. And lastly, if you had a blank cheque from the research councils, what would be the top areas of research where there are gaps today in e-cigarettes and heat-not-burns that you would like to spend that money on?
Would you like to spend some money first?
All right, let's spend money first.
Hypothetically,
clearly long-term, longitudinal studies will give us the best indicator of long-term health outcomes. That would take a lot of money because they would be 20 plus years, and we'll be looking at actual health outcomes. Obviously we can't wait that long. We do need to have a bit more of an idea now. So I think the second area would be flavorings, because there has been research already shown that there can be huge variations in levels of potentially harmful compounds depending on the flavour. But not just the flavour. I mean, we've also found different levels of aldehydes in the same flavour, but from different batches. So it's not the flavour per se. I think this goes back to a point that was made earlier, but it's the various compounds that make up that flavour, which may be present in one batch, but not in another batch. So I'm sorry, it's even more complicated than just flavourings.
You may not know the answer, but do we make flavours in this country or do we import them? Do you know?
I think they can be made in this country and they can be imported.
And are they subject to normal kind of chemical regulations, the REACH chemical regulations?
I'm not sure on that.
Okay. They will be assessed, yeah. So they will go through that process, and flavourings are being looked at EU-wide at the minute.
Okay, and in terms of your answer, Professor Harrison, on the
yes, spending some money. I would like to spend some money.
So the key gaps, what would you spend the money on?
I think some money around standardisation, which is standardisation of the research. UK government has actually invested very heavily in systems biology, and one of the speakers referred to systems toxicology, which PMI in particular have done, which is basically computationally modelling, so taking information and using that in a dynamic sense to try and make predictive models. So you can tell after 2 years that something's happening rather than waiting for 20. So a lot of money's been spent on that, so actually targeting some additional funding there would be useful. And then I think it's the longer term epidemiology. And that's not without its challenges, because people may start and stop, they may smoke cigarettes sometimes, they may use heat not burn sometimes. But actually there's increasing evidence, particularly from the Far East, that even 1-2 cigarettes a day, if you do big enough studies, will show a risk of lung cancer. So if you take an average as being 20, that's a 95% reduction in cigarette smoking might still increase the rate of lung cancer. So that kind of puts into perspective that if there's 40,000 people a year dying in this country, 400 would be 1%, so 2,000 would be 5%. So I think those long-term epidemiology studies, not just saying, well, there's no risk, let's go for it. It's saying this may be the best thing to do, but that does not mean that these are risk-free.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Very much appreciated for your answers and for your attendance today. Thank you for joining us.
Do I have time for one final point?
Please, yes, if you have.
Sorry. I would like to pick up on the point that Moira made earlier about this plateau in number of people taking up electronic cigarettes. And I think much research is on current vapors. They're probably okay. They've made the switch. We need to concentrate on smokers. Why are smokers not making the switch? And why are half of smokers who have tried electronic cigarettes not fully transitioning? This may be partly due to the nicotine concentrations, it may be partly due to the health messages, but I think we need to make them as attractive as possible to smokers, and that means having a variety of different products, not one size doesn't fit all, and having different concentrations of nicotine available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Harrison, is there anything you'd like to finally say on?
That's a great way of job creation for risk managers, but I absolutely agree. Actually, if we're going to use this as a strategy, it has to be diverse and appropriate for different people.
Okay. Again, thank you both for joining us. Order, order.